There are three basic categories of civil liberties guaranteed to American citizens. The first category are your freedom of expression rights. These are your freedom of speech, press, and assembly guaranteed to you by the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights. The second category of civil liberties relates to your freedom of religion in two separate clauses, also found in the First Amendment. And finally, there are a set of due process civil liberties, which protect the rights of the accused, and we're going to discuss each of these in turn. The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution protects your freedom of expression, protects your right to express yourself without fear of being punished by the government. Now, this includes speech, writing, and assemblies that may be hateful, disgusting, despised by the public. Irregardless, it is protected. While we may not want to allow the KKK to speak publicly, we have to consider the alternative, and the alternative is who gets to decide what speech can be punished. If we are going to prohibit some speech, there must be someone who has the power to decide what speech is okay and what is not. You should be wary of putting that power in someone's hands. Unfortunately, your freedom of expression is not universally guaranteed. There are times when your government has repeatedly limited your civil liberties in this area. In particular, the United States government has a long history of limiting free speech rights in times of war in the interest of national security. This is particularly important to remember when you consider that the last time the United States declared war officially was World War II. Since then, every military engagement that we've been involved in, up to and including Iraq and Afghanistan, are not technically wars. However, in times of war or warlike activity, the national government may restrict your freedom of speech for national security purposes. Setting aside wartime restrictions, there are other types of speech that are not protected. The first category of unprotected speech is libel and slander. Slander is when you say something about another person which you know to be untrue that defames the person's character. This is known as slander. When you write something about someone else that you know to be untrue that defames their character, this is known as libel. And neither of these qualify as protected free speech. It's interesting to note that celebrities, politicians, anyone who willingly puts themselves out into the public spotlight does not have the same protections against libelous slander as a private citizen like you or I would. So, when nasty rumors, your favorite celebrities show up on the tabloids, the standard for them proving libelous slander is much higher. There's a second category of speech that is not universally protected, and that is symbolic speech. When you do something to express an opinion, this is symbolic speech. So burning a flag, for example, is known as symbolic speech. You are taking an action, burning a flag, to get across a message. Some symbolic speech, like burning a flag, is protected. Other symbolic speech is not. And it's not always clear what types of activities qualify as protected symbolic speech, so be careful. And finally, obscenity is not protected. For years, the United States Supreme Court defined obscenity as "I know it when I see it." Fortunately for us, the Supreme Court has developed a slightly more usable definition of obscenity, and that's what you see here. The Supreme Court now says, to be obscene, the work taken as a whole must be judged by the average person, applying contemporary community standards to appeal to the prurient interest, or to depict a patently offensive way sexual conduct specifically defined by applicable state law to lack serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. In addition to being long-winded, it's not that helpful because it's awful vague. You have the problem of looking at it, the average person. contemporary community standards, which means not only do we have to figure out what on earth an average person is, we have to recognize that contemporary community standards change across time and by region. What may be considered okay in San Francisco may be considered obscene in Alabama. You also have to consider the end of this definition. It must lack serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. And determining artistic value, as we all know, can be extraordinarily difficult. This is what we have, though. It is important to note that nudity and sexual depictions are not necessarily obscene. This is how we end up with pornography being legally protected in the United States. Your freedom of religion is the second category of civil liberties protected by the U.S. Constitution. And your religious freedoms come from the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution in two separate clauses. The first is the Free Exercise Clause, which essentially says that you can practice any religion that you want in any way that you want with only some moderate restrictions. So, if your religion requires that you sacrifice a goat, you can do so. If your religion requires you to refrain from work on Sundays, you have every right to do so. If your religion requires that you sacrifice a virgin on the full moon, you can't. There are reasonable restrictions, but as long as you don't harm anyone else directly, the Free Exercise Clause generally protects your religious freedom. The second religious freedom you have comes from the Establishment Clause, and this essentially says that the government will not establish an official religion or treat one religion better than another. So the national government is not allowed to treat one religious faith as better, more true, or with more respect than any other. This is often summed up as the notion of separation of church and state. It is important to note that this phrase, separation of church and state, does not appear in the U.S. Constitution or the amendments. That phrase was written by Thomas Jefferson in a private letter to the Danbury Baptists. The final set of civil liberties we're going to discuss are your due process rights, the best known of which are your Miranda rights. These came out of the U.S. Supreme Court case Miranda v. Arizona in 1966. Ernesto Miranda was arrested on suspicion of rape and kidnapping. He was interrogated for several hours, after which he signed a confession. He was subsequently convicted on these charges and sentenced to a lengthy prison sentence. He appealed this case to the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing that he was not aware that he did not have to answer the police officer's questions. As a result, the Supreme Court said that the police must inform suspects of their constitutional rights before questioning, or else what they say cannot be used against them in court. The Miranda warning varies depending on where you are, but essentially says that you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney, and if you cannot afford one, one will be appointed for you. If you've ever seen an episode of Law and Order, this is essentially what the practice looks like.